Hello, I'm Martin Lewis, Senior Lecturer Emeritus in the Department of History at Stanford University, and this is Lecture 5 in the Geocurrent series on the historical geography of psychoactive substances. And the topic of today's lecture is tea, the second in the two lectures on major caffeine plants, the first being previous lecture on coffee. An interesting thing about tea is that it is actually a species of the genus Camellia. Camellias are well known as ornamental plants, flowering plants. It's a large genus, but Camellia sinensis, meaning the camellia of China, is the main plant used for tea. Some other camellia species are used for tea occasionally. Camellia is also important for producing edible oils. It's an important genus, to be sure. New genera of camellia continue to be discovered. Here's an article from just a few years ago, well, a decade ago, of four new species being discovered in Vietnam. As far as the range of camellia goes, it's difficult to find a good map. The only one I was really able to find is this one from the Kew Gardens. So the green is showing the range of camellia species of various types. You can see the range extends from the Himalayan mountains and Nepal and the northeastern part of India up to Japan and into Southeast Asia. It's not a particularly good map because it's mapping according to geopolitical units, both countries and, in the case of China and India, subdivisions of country. But it's true for Argentina as well. And plants do not follow geopolitical lines, but it's as good as I could find. And you can see that various species have also spread into the wild in several other parts of the world. So this map of the tea and coffee worlds that I made a few years ago was used in the coffee lecture as well, but we'll look today at the green, which shows the top 16 tea consuming countries, not producing, but consuming. You can see they are scattered over a pretty large area of the world: North Africa, Europe, and much of Asia. Interesting that China and India are not on the map, although they come pretty close to that category. They don't quite fall into it. With the highest level of tea consumption, interestingly, in Turkey, and we'll talk about Turkish tea culture later on. You have to beware when you look at these kind of maps because tea is sometimes confused with other plant products, particularly yerba mate, which is a species of holly, very rich in caffeine, that's very important in southern South America: Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and southern Brazil. So this list of top tea consumption by country from the World Population Review gets it wrong by a huge margin by including yerba mate in those figures. A little more detailed map, a bit more out of date. Another map I made, this is 2009, but it's just showing tea consumption by country, at least according to official statistics. So countries in blue have high levels of tea consumption and in red low. So you could see that tea is not much consumed in much of Latin America and much of Africa. Interesting, Philippines is in that category as well. But countries in the blue that have pretty substantial levels of tea consumption cover much of the world, and you can see China and India are certainly in this category. Now, confusion sometimes results from the difference between different kinds of tea, green tea and black tea in particular. It's important to note that it's the same product from the same plant. It's just a processing difference where you have oxidation, whether or not oxidation is present or to what extent it is present, that is going to differentiate black tea from green tea. As with all of these psychoactive substances, I want to talk a little bit about the source, the domestication of them, and I'll look both at scientific evidence but also at the legendary, sort of mythological almost, stories about how different psychoactive substances came to be used by people. We talked about this with caffeine in coffee, but with tea you have somewhat similar stories. In China, tea is often linked back to Shen Nong, the divine farmer, a mythological ruler in essentially minor deity in Chinese and Vietnamese folk religion, folk beliefs, if you will. So the story has it that in a very precise year, 2737 BCE, a servant was boiling water and a leaf from the wild tea bush fell into the pot. And Shen Nong found it flavorful and useful and energizing, and hence tea was born. It's one of these just so stories. What we do know pretty well is that tea in its early period in China was associated with Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, or Greater Vehicle Buddhism, which had entered East Asia, China at first. The map shows the spread of Buddhism. It originated in northern India. The Buddha was actually born in southern Nepal, but northern India was the first focus. Buddhism was eventually to largely disappear from India, but it spread outward. Note that it did not spread to China directly because of intervening mountains, gorges, high plateaus. Instead, it went to the northwest and then got into the Central Asian trade routes, sometimes known as the Silk Roads, and entered China through that pathway. And then Buddhism spread from China to Korea, hence to Japan, into Vietnam. Now, the other main school of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, which is more important in mainland Southeast Asia, spread from Sri Lanka to Burma, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. But tea consumption was definitely linked with the Mahayana or Greater Vehicle Buddhism of East Asia, of China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. So there's a second legendary source of tea which links it to Buddhism, where it is known as actually known as the eyelids of Bodhidharma or Daruma in Japan. You can see an ad for a work here on tea, subtitled "The Eyelids of Bodhidharma," and we have an illustration of Bodhidharma. He does not look Chinese because he was not. He was well, if he existed at all, but all the legends depict him as a person of Central Asian physical appearance. So this legend is linked to Central Asian Buddhist monks coming into China, and it's interesting that he is linked to tea, which almost certainly originated not in Central Asia, but in China, in southern China in particular. Why the eyelids? Well, here we have the legend that he once fell asleep while meditating and was so furious that he succumbed to sleep that he cut off his eyelids, which then fell to the ground and grew into the first tea plants. Tea was afterwards supplied to the monks as protection against sleep. They could then sit and meditate through the whole night, and that was how tea was discovered. Well, this is definitely a mythological story, but it's interesting because of the close parallel with coffee, which we saw in the previous lecture, was first spread outside of Ethiopia through Sufi Muslim mystics who had these all-night chanting and dancing sessions to help them experience the divine, and they found that coffee drinking helped them stay awake. So real close parallel here. Anyway, it does look like tea was domesticated in southern China. The particular species, Camellia sinensis, is found in the far south, particularly south-central China, and on into a little bit of northeastern India as well. The white line on the map I have shows the presumable area of tea consumption in about the year 1500, and it's difficult to make maps like this. Sources are uncertain, but it was certainly throughout East Asia into Tibet, Mongolia, and at least the mainland parts of Southeast Asia. So moving from the Buddhist monastic cultural milieu into elite culture really occurred in the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 AD or CE, very powerful dynasty. And it is associated with some historical figures, particularly Lu Yu, who was known as the Sage of Tea and wrote a monumental book called The Classic of Tea. And so this was the first work, at least that we know of, that discusses cultivating tea, making tea, brewing tea, and really putting it in a principal place sort of in the cultural environment of China at the time. Not surprisingly, he stressed its beneficial effects. One thing, though, that that he didn't know was that tea was very healthful just by virtue of boiling the water, which is done before tea is made, obviously. In all agricultural parts of the world, water was often contaminated with various microorganisms. As we saw in the first lecture on alcohol, beer drinking was incredibly common in medieval and early modern Europe, partly because the alcohol would kill microorganisms that made plain water unsafe to drink. So China had a sort of a health advantage from the early period as tea spread, simply because it entailed the boiling of water. And just to note, the early Tang Dynasty, where tea was popularized, was a very powerful state. It by no means included all of what is now China. It did include what is now the northern part of Vietnam, but also had a tremendous cultural and, well, more than cultural, mostly a sort of a military and political sway into Central Asia. You could see Chinese protectorates in Central Asia on this map. As tea spread in China, after sort of escaping the monastic confines, it was adopted by elite culture, and this continued in the Song Dynasty in particular, which lasted from 960 to 1279. Tea drinking became a very important part of elite culture, with formal tea tasting parties, tea structures usually built outside in garden environments, with coverings, a whole aesthetic tying tea with poetry, with aesthetically appealing serving vessels that would also be discussed. So this sort of wasn't really a formal ritualized tea consumption, but it was tied up with this elite sort of cultural environment. Tea evolved in China. Originally, brick tea was used, where the tea leaves were highly compressed, as you can see in the illustration on the bottom left. You had these stamped bricks that made it easy to transport, easy to store as well for longer periods of time. You'd have to break up the bricks before you brewed it. That was the most common way tea was consumed in China during the Tang Dynasty. In the succeeding Song Dynasty, there was a move to powdered tea. You can see the green powdered tea. That's obviously a modern, they're all modern photos. And then moving in the Ming period, after 368, to loose tea or roll tea that would be seeped. Some of the earlier forms persisted, and they had a different history of persisting in different parts of East Asia. So brick tea continued to be used partly because it was so much easier to export. So there was a major export trade from China up to the Tibetan Plateau. Tibet wasn't really part of China until the Qing or Manchu dynasty in the early modern period, but there was extensive trade. Because the Tibetan Plateau is rough, human porters were often used, and you could see that they would carry large racks of brick tea, and this continued all the way up into the 20th century, as this photograph shows. And in Tibet, tea became very important, not just as a drink, but really as a food, insofar as it was and is to this day served with yak butter. So it's oily, nutritious, definitely has a practical purpose, and that's a very important morning beverage throughout the Tibetan Plateau. And not just Tibet, but also Mongolia. Obviously, you can't grow tea, or tea is only going to grow in a tropical or subtropical environment. It cannot take cold temperatures. It can take a little frost, even a little snow, but not intensive cold. So you certainly couldn't grow it in Tibet or in Mongolia, but the Tibetans and Mongolians became habituated to tea drinking, so there had to be, again, an export trade. We see here a statue of camels, the two-humped Bactrian camel of Central Asia, laden with brick tea going from China into Mongolia. And we probably all heard a bit about the Silk Road, but scholars also talk about the tea road or the tea route, which was from southern China, where tea was produced, by sea to northern China, and then by these camel caravans to Mongolia. Trade with Russia along this border introduced the Russians to tea, and already by the 1600s or 17th century, there was a lively tea trade all the way to Russia. Now, with distances like that, as you can imagine, tea was very much an elite drink in Russia in the early modern period, and would later spread to popular culture, but it was quite expensive bringing it overland, as you could imagine. Tea spread to Japan with Buddhism, which happened in the 6th century, but really became popular with the samurai or elite military class by the 12th century. So the map sort of shows spread of tea in Asia, although not very accurately. But you could see, as the text shows, tea seeds got to China from Zen monks. So Zen, or Chan, it was called in China, was a particular sect of Mahayana Buddhism, which developed in China, spread to Korea, then spread to Japan. And there was a lot of back and forth of monks, and tea was widely consumed in the monastic communities of China, and then spread to the monastic communities of the Zen Buddhists in Japan. This was during a period when it was popularized, was when green powdered tea was the most important tea of China, and that's what spread to Japan. So Japan has very little black tea. It's almost all green, although interestingly, it's not always green in color. So you have the classic powdered green tea of Japan, matcha. Then it can be rolled instead of powdered, and it's called sencha. The stems are used for kuki cha, and then afterwards it can be roasted and become sort of brown and hoji cha, so different kinds of tea in Japan. But they would all be considered green tea because of the way of original processing. And I should note that matcha is now especially much more than tea. You can see matcha ice cream, matcha cold drink. My wife loves to make matcha smoothies, a matcha cheesecake, matcha sushi. So that matcha powdered tea can be used in many, many different foodstuffs. Anyway, in medieval Japan, tea was closely associated with Zen Buddhism and with samurai culture, because the samurai, the ruling elite, took to Zen Buddhism in a major way. It became the most important Buddhist sect for the samurai. There were a great variety of Buddhist sects in Japan, some more popular than others. Zen, though, was the most important for the samurai. And one thing I want to note about the samurai is they were certainly started out as a military class or caste that took power in the medieval period. After Japan was largely unified in around 1600 under the Tokugawa shogunate, so this is sometimes called the Edo Japan period. Edo was the previous name for Tokyo. Japan after 1600 had essentially 250 years of peace, and so the warrior caste continued to have its formal military aspects, but didn't do very much fighting at all. Instead, the samurai essentially became an elite bureaucratic class. Although I should say not all samurai were wealthy. They all got a stipend in rice, but some of them were relatively poor, but they certainly were an elite culture. And in this milieu, what is known as the way of tea was developed. The tea ceremony. Tea ceremony is a place for meditation and relaxation, stressing purity, tranquility, and harmony. and an idea that one would be present in the moment during the tea ceremony. And this was also connected with a heightened awareness of the seasons and where you were in the year. So highly ritualized, both in the preparation, the tools that were used, whipping this frothy green tea, consumption in tea rooms, following a particular order of preparing and consuming. There's quite an accurate portrayal of the tea ceremony just before the year 1600 in the TV series Shogun. I've talked to several people who know medieval and early modern Japan quite well. My wife is a scholar of early modern Japan. And I've been told that it's really quite a good depiction. If you do watch this, you can see season 8. It's a husband and wife, and they're making these minute observations about the seasons, what's blooming, and that is very legitimate part of how tea ceremonies often work. That's to sort of be in the present, where you are, when you are. A tea culture and tea ceremony in Japan is closely linked to a particular historical person, Sen no Rikyu. He was the founding figure of what is known as the Way of Tea. This was right during the period when Japan is being unified. He wasn't just interested in tea consumption, he was interested in a sort of a philosophy, a way of life, a series of rituals tied to tea. And Rikyu stressed this rustic simplicity, directness of approach, honesty of self, often described as a Renaissance man. And he developed a particular school of tea ceremony that evolved into several different competing schools. There are now 3 Japanese tea schools that follow his teaching. So yes, it's a beverage, but it's much more than that when you go into this sort of tea culture or tea ritual. And it had political implications. Sen no Rikyu himself was a very politically influential man. He was one of the closest confidants of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi was known as the second of the 3 unifiers of Japan. There was a figure named Oda Nobunaga who was sort of the first to try to unify these squabbling feudal domains and made quite a bit of progress. Hideyoshi started out as a peasant, really succeeded in tying Japan together, but he was assassinated, and it was his successor, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who really succeeded in unifying Japan. But Hideyoshi was a very powerful and very troubled figure in many ways. Some suspect that he was close to insane by the time of his death. But anyway, even though Sen no Rikyu was one of his closest confidants, the tea master showed too much independence and was ultimately ordered to commit ritual suicide, seppuku or harakiri, harikiri if you will, ritual disembowelment. So there's a Japanese film, Death of a Tea Master, that shows this. Anyway, moving from East Asia to the West, tea came pretty early into Europe in the early modern period after 1500, after the period of global exploration of the Europeans. And just like coffee, it first entered as a medicine sold in apothecary shops. So limited market, didn't spread much at first. But certainly in England, it spread very rapidly in the late 1600s after King Charles II. This is after the Puritan dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell. You have the restoration of the English monarchy. Portugal was a close ally of England. They were both opposed to Spain. Portugal actually had been under Spanish rule from 1580 to 1640, and the Portuguese were eager to remain independent, so they had this close relationship with England, even though England was Protestant by this time and Portugal Catholic. So the wife of King Charles II was Catherine de Braganza, and she had already acquired the habit of drinking tea. Portugal was the first European country to make close connections with East Asia. They had a little colonial outpost in southern China, Macau, for many hundreds of years. And many of them acquired tea drinking, and so Catherine comes in and is very influential as the queen, and tea begins to spread. Thomas Twining, though, is often said to have really revolutionized tea culture in the early 1700s. He creates a coffee house, and has had a number of innovations, but one was allowing unchaperoned women into tea houses. If you watch the earlier lecture on coffee houses were a male space, and respectable women were not really allowed in coffee houses, or certainly wouldn't have been tolerated there. But under Twining and others, tea house became a very different thing, a place where men and women could socialize together, so they were sharply differentiated. Tea is also linked to pleasure gardens. In particular, there was something known as the Vauxhall Gardens. This is a period where there wasn't a lot of green space in the burgeoning city of London, but you had this large garden park, essentially, if you will, that had a wide array of entertainment options. It drew enormous crowds. If you're interested in a fictional depiction, I would recommend William Thackeray's Vanity Fair, where there's a long scene of the protagonist, Becky Sharp, and her friends visiting Vauxhall and going into the garden. But anyway, this was a period when there was a passion for Chinese style. There was tremendous trade between Britain and China, so there was the so-called chinoiserie style of Chinese buildings, even certainly porcelain serving implements and the like, and tea is being served there, and that's helping popularize tea. Tea at first was, at first it was a medicinal drink, then it spreads into the royalty, then it spreads into the aristocracy and upper middle class, gentry, merchant class as well, and eventually it becomes cheap enough to spread into the middling, and even lower classes, but that takes a while. But by the 1840s, tea is becoming not just a drink, but at least the term tea connotes a meal. Here's a little advertisement for a cookbook from England, an online source. What's for tea this week? I vaguely remember the first time I heard someone from Britain talking about what's for tea, and I was totally mystified. Well, the only thing I could think of, wouldn't tea be for tea? But soon learned as probably a teenager at that time, that tea in the United Kingdom means not just tea, but it also means a late afternoon meal, or even what we in the United States would call dinner or supper. Tea time around 4 p.m. As an established period to drink tea and eat food along with it is almost universally credited to Anna Russell, who was the Duchess of Bedford, but more importantly was Queen Victoria's closest friend. So we can see here there's a tea brand called Duchess of Bedford, and here we see Anna Russell in a depiction from Wikipedia. She died in 1857. So she was very close to Queen Victoria. And the story was that she complained about being kind of famished in the late afternoon, and asked for tea, bread, butter, and cake around 4 p.m., started doing that daily. That spread to others, and tea time then becomes a social institution with the aristocracy, and then moving down the social ladder to the gentry, into the upper middle class, and eventually throughout the country. Now, probably most people have heard of the term, most Americans, I should say, high tea. I always thought of high tea as a particularly sort of genteel or elite way of drinking tea and eating scones or crumpets or whatever, and was actually surprised to learn that I kind of had it backwards. So afternoon tea in Britain traditionally is served late afternoon at low tables. It's focused around drinking tea, but also eating essentially snacks, maybe some scones, sandwiches, or some cake. But it is not a sit-down meal. High tea, on the other time, as you can see from the illustration, historically a term reserved for post-work meal, what we in the United States would have originally called supper, now more often called dinner, eaten at a high table, often a counter, with a full meal. So when you say what's for tea, meaning what's for the evening meal, which is going to be served with tea. So high tea actually was more common in the middle and working classes as an after-work meal. Anyway, tea became such an important import into the United Kingdom that it caused a big economic problem. That problem being the outflow of silver to pay for Chinese tea. The Chinese did not want to produce British manufactured products. Britain tried extensively. They had a major mission, the Macartney mission in the late 1700s, to try to convince the Chinese to start importing woolens or other manufactured products from the United Kingdom. And the Chinese emperor of the Qing dynasty said, we are not interested in your products. We are self-sufficient. What we want is silver. China was desperately short of silver, which it needed for its monetary system. But the British were not happy about sending so much silver to pay for tea. So they essentially came up with two solutions. One is to pay for tea by selling Indian opium produced in the British colony of India. China didn't like that. That results in the Opium War, and I will lecture on that at some length in the later lecture on opium in the same series. The second solution was to try to grow tea in India. Now, the wild tea plant is found in the far northeast of India, but it was not grown. It wasn't cultivated. Nobody really knew how to cultivate it or how to process it. But eventually that solution is also used by the British Empire. And I should note that both of these solutions, if you will, had extremely bad outcomes for China. The opium importation was devastating, but eventually British India overtakes China as a tea producer, and China had relied very extensively on tea exports to maintain its economy, and so it suffered a double blow, if you will. Taking tea to India was a difficult process, and it involved specialized people. And I'll focus here a little bit on Robert Fortune, very interesting name, who we could regard as an imperial botanical prospector and industrial spy. There were a number of people in service of the British Empire, the British East India Company, and the empire more generally, and other parts of the world, finding drugs, medicinal drugs, recreational drugs as well, and taking them to British colonies, to Kew Gardens in London. I'll talk about Kew Gardens at some length later on. But you could see here an article from Smithsonian called The Great British Tea Heist. Botanist Robert Fortune traveled to China and stole trade secrets about the tea industry, discovering fraud in the process. Fraud in China, I should say. So it was more than the trade secrets. Fortune was given the task of actually getting nursery stock, getting seeds or seedlings that you could grow in Indian tea farms, and to learn how to process it and how to grow it. These were things that the British didn't know about. Anyway, it's a very interesting story. He spent a lot of time in China, traveled extensively, was able to do what he set out to do. There were some shenanigans involved, to be sure. He comes back and exhibits his findings at the Crystal Palace. This was the great exhibition of 1851. This gargantuan glass conservatory, which became the site of what really might call the first World's Fair, the great exhibit of the work of the industry of all nations. This was a cultural phenomenon of great proportions in mid-19th century Britain. But what Fortune had discovered was that the Chinese were actually adulterating a lot of their tea with plaster and also with Prussian blue, a dye to give it a brighter color. And these kind of adulterants were not appreciated by the consuming public. So Fortune and others continued to push for British-produced tea in India, in the British colony. It took a while. It was a few decades, but it eventually was very successful. And by 1888, Indian exports exceeded those of China, and India went on to produce vast quantities of tea, and China's industry was crippled in the process. Now, there's an issue of where to produce tea in India. Like I say, the tea plant, Camellia sinensis, grows in the wild in the far northeast, and so that was the area chosen. Tea plantations were developed in Assam. That's on the map on the left there. Assam is in the tropical lowlands, most of it anyway, and it didn't produce particularly high-quality tea. But in the Himalayan mountains, particularly in and around the city of Darjeeling, which is part of the Indian state of what is now West Bengal, mid-latitude area with a very mild climate, never hot, never cold, quite humid. Anyway, this is an excellent place to grow tea, and it became noted for its high-quality tea. Tea also spread into southern India, particularly the highlands of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, mountainous areas, and India became a huge tea producer. As did what was then known as Ceylon, or today the country of Sri Lanka, island to the south of India, another British colony. And if you watched the earlier lecture on coffee, you know that Ceylon was a huge coffee producer, and then the coffee rust, leaf rust hit, and the coffee plantations were wiped out. They were quickly replaced by tea plantations, and Sri Lanka today is a major tea-growing country. And the map shows tea-growing areas. The most important are in those red areas, which is the highland zone, which tends to produce the more high-quality tea. Tea, as everyone who studied American colonial history figured prominently in the American Revolution. There was the famous Boston Tea Party, when American patriots dressed up as indigenous or Native Americans crept into British ships importing tea and threw all the tea into the harbor. There were other tea parties, something called the Philadelphia Tea Party. They didn't throw tea into the bay, but they would not, American workers would not unload it, and basically the ship had to go back to the United Kingdom. This Tea Party came from opposition to the British Tea Act of 1773, which was designed to help the struggling British East India Company. Then the British East India Company was a overwhelmingly profitable firm. It had monopoly trade privileges. It controlled most of India by the early 1800s, but it had a rough spot in the 1770s, partly because of a major famine in Bengal. There were other sorts of reasons, but it was financially strapped for a while. So the Tea Act of 1773 actually reduced taxes on tea to undermine smuggling. So the problem was taxes had been so high, there was a huge amount of smuggling, which was undermining it. And so it reduced taxes. It did maintain some taxes, though. But the American colonists were very angry about this. They were angry because, for a variety of reasons. Ostensibly, it was because these taxation decisions were being made without representation. So that the tagline was "No taxation without representation." But there were broader issues involved. At this time, it's estimated that up to 86% of tea in America was actually smuggled in. The Dutch were involved in this, and a lot of Americans were involved in the smuggling as well. And by reducing taxation to undermine smuggling, that actually hurt a number of maritime interests in the United States. The British, not surprised, were appalled by the Boston Tea Parties and others, supposedly even those sympathetic to the American cause. This is a controversial subject. If you want background on it, I would recommend Malcolm Gladwell. He has a podcast called Revisionist History, and there's an episode on Tempest in a Teapot, where he basically claims the Boston Tea Party was carried out by American smugglers, mostly concerned with their own profits. That may be a bit simplified. There were many issues involved, and there certainly was a lot of anger at the fact that taxation policy for the colonies was being determined by Parliament without direct input by the Americans themselves. In the American Revolutionary War, there was a certain sort of denunciation of tea. It didn't last very long, or at least after the Revolution, but there's a very interesting letter from John Adams to his wife, Abigail Adams, in 1776, the crucial year here. But anyway, just to read it, John said, "I believe I forgot to tell you one anecdote. When I first came to this house, it was late in the afternoon, and I had ridden 35 miles at least. 'Madam,' I said to Mrs. Hutton, 'is it lawful for a weary traveler to refresh himself with a dish of tea, provided that it has been honestly smuggled or paid no duties?' 'No, sir,' she said, 'we have renounced tea in this place. I cannot make tea, but he can make you coffee. Accordingly, I have drank coffee every afternoon since, and I have borne it well. Tea must be universally renounced. I must be weaned, and the sooner the better.'" That lasts through the Revolutionary period, but afterwards Americans returned to tea in large numbers. In fact, the U.S. was instrumental in the creation of the fastest sailing ships in the world, the clipper ship. Now, the clipper ships were built in Britain as well. Some scholars, though, suggest that they were first developed in Chesapeake Bay in the late 1700s. But what the clipper was a sailing ship designed for speed. You could just see from this illustration, a narrow hull, very well-engineered shape, and just huge sails to get maximum speed. The boom years for the clipper ship were from 1840s up to the creation of the Suez Canal in 1869, which pretty much undermined it. Plus, we get steamships coming in at about the same time. But mid-1800s, the clippers were the fastest ships, and their most important role was to bring tea from China as quickly as possible, because tea does not improve with age, so you want fresh tea. So you could see this ship here in the illustration, the Taiping, a Chinese name, a tea clipper built in 1863, right before the end of the clipper period. The British clippers even had informal tea races, competing to be the first to London, and the voyage could be done in as little as 90 days. But the Great Tea Race of 1866 was keenly followed by the English press, and ship Taiping docked 28 minutes before its main rival Ariel. This is a big deal at the time. One other thing I would like to note, though, is the Americans in the late 1800s until 1920 were drinking more tea from Japan than from China. Originally, it had been mostly from China, but after Japan was opened to trade forcibly by the United States in the 1850s, Americans really turned to Japanese green tea. And this is not well known. It was sort of forgotten episode, but historian of Japan Robert Hellyer researched it and recently wrote a book called Green with Milk and Sugar, When Japan Filled America's Teacups, and shows that actually the U.S. was late 1800s, early 1900s drinking mostly Japanese tea. And then, as he shows in the 1920s, socioeconomic trends and racial prejudice against Japanese turned Americans to black tea from Ceylon, in other words, Sri Lanka and India. produced in the British Empire, ironically enough. The United States eventually becomes a predominantly iced tea drinking country. Supposedly about 85% of tea consumed in the United States is iced. And the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904 is usually credited with popularizing iced tea. So it had been widely consumed for a few decades, but World's Fairs were big deals in this period. They attracted a lot of attention, not only people visiting them, but also a lot of press attention. If you've been to St. Louis in the summer, you know it can be dreadfully hot, not necessarily pleasant to drink a hot beverage, but an iced beverage can become very pleasant. Ice was becoming cheaper, and so iced tea became very popular. There are differences in how iced tea is consumed. In the south of the United States, it tends to be very sweet with a lot of sugar, so there are regional variations. An odd and interesting thing about the United States is the odd gendering of tea. I don't think this is really true in any other country. I've certainly noticed it, but anyway, a publication known as Taste has this interesting article, Wimp Juice, America's Long Strange History of Gendering Tea, where tea is associated with women and not so much with men. And you have a company here trying to reach the male audience, the male consuming public, if you will. So it's interesting. Econ's 5 teas come with butch names like Clean Machine, Pound Hacker, Dayholic, and have ingredients that benefit the male body. What that would mean, I have no idea. But that's just a sort of an oddity in the United States. Anyway, back to our map of the top 16 tea consuming countries. I want to end this lecture by just talking a little bit about some distinctive national tea cultures. I want to look at Turkey, Iran, Russia, and India briefly. But Turkey is interesting in that it is the number 1 tea consuming country on a per capita basis, and the number 5 tea exporting country. So Turkey has extensive tea farming, has a particular way of consuming it in not in cups but in those tulip-shaped glasses. But it's become a very important part of Turkish culture. If you remember, Turkey had been the Ottoman Empire in those days, the first state in which coffee consumption became very widespread. And today, Turkey is known for its very strong Turkish coffee, but tea is far more important in Turkey than is coffee. Interesting history. This dates back to the late Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic, founded in the early 1920s after the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I. But coffee had to be imported, quite expensive, and the Ottoman and then Turkish governments wanted to encourage tea consumption because tea could be cultivated in Turkey, whereas coffee could not. And there's a very specific place in Turkey where tea is cultivated. It's in the far northeastern part of the country near the Black Sea. The reason for this is climatological. This is a precipitation map in millimeters. But you could see that area of Turkey is by far the wettest region. It essentially has a humid subtropical climate. It gets a little bit of frost, but not very much. It gets plentiful precipitation. Tea plant needs a lot of moisture, and it cannot tolerate cold temperatures. Like I say, it could take a light snow, a little bit of frost, but not any sort of intense cold. And so that's really the only place in Turkey that it is going to thrive. Interestingly, Russia produces tea as well, and imports most of its tea. If you remember, originally it was through these camel caravans through Mongolia and Central Asia. Eventually it's importing directly from China by sea routes, but the Russians, as tea consumption extends from the elite down into poorer classes, it becomes a big burden for Russia to be importing such large quantities of tea, and so they're searching for a place to produce it themselves. And there's one very small part of Russia, uh, very close to the Turkish area of tea production, that has a similar climate. It's very humid. It's protected from the cold of Central Asia by the Caucasus Mountains. So it is essentially a humid subtropical region. Some of you may have remembered the Russian Winter Olympics in Sochi. Sochi is a major resort area on the Black Sea in this humid subtropical zone, but it's close to mountains that get quite a bit of snow. But Sochi itself gets relatively little snow. It's interesting, in looking for illustrations on this, they have tea plantations with snow on them in Russia. Well, this is rare because in the tea growing areas, it's very mild. It's subtropical. It rarely snows. Occasionally it does, and as I say, tea can take a light snow. But the article here is how the world's most northern tea grows in Russia's most southern resort. And an illustration of an outdoor tea party. What you can see in that illustration is the samovar, so I just want to mention that. So the samovar is very important, not just in Russian tea culture. It's a Russian term, and it was originated in Russia, but spread to Turkey and Iran as well. So the samovar is an apparatus in which you can, at least in the traditional form, you have a central core in which you put burning charcoal, and then you have a water jacket around that, and then a spigot or a tap. So it would heat water and keep it hot for a long period of time. So for tea consumption over a long period of time, for tea consumption out of the house in outdoor settings, which was very common, the samovar could be used. And a lot of these samovars were very elaborately decorated. Of course, they could be very simple as well. But with some of these elaborate ones, it shows continuing connection with elite culture. So samovars used in Iran. You could see one in the illustration on the far right in Isfahan, and an outdoor setting. So Iran is somewhat like Turkey. It's not just a major tea drinking country, but it also has its own tea industry, tea cultivation. Like Turkey, Iran is a relatively arid country. Much of it is desert or semi-arid. But in the far north, just south of the Caspian Sea, it has another one of these somewhat unique humid subtropical zones. The Caspian Sea, which is by far the world's largest lake, is large enough to moderate the climate. Winds blowing over the Caspian bring abundant precipitation, so you have this narrow zone. You could see it's actually green coloration on a satellite image. This is a region of Iran with not only tea plantations, but rice fields, dense subtropical forests. Until relatively recently, tigers and leopards lived in the mountains there. They are now gone, but that's a relatively recent loss of wildlife. So anyway, Iran had a gradual switch from coffee to tea starting around 1830. This was tied up with increased trade from China. And then tea saplings were brought from India and established in northern Iran. So Iran tea culture is similar to that of Turkey. It's served in the same kind of glass tulip-shaped vessels. The map shows the tea growing zone, and the photo a tea farm. India is interesting. India does not figure so prominently in the per capita map of tea production, but for Indian middle class and upper class, tea is the most important, caffeinated beverage, if not beverage overall. A lot of people in India, very poor people, have not traditionally consumed much tea, but tea consumption is spreading. But India has been this major tea producer since the late 1800s, but it really wasn't much of a tea consumer. So it produced but exported tea. Indian tea producers started pushing or advocating domestic consumption in the late 1800s, and it took a while, but it became a nationally important drink by the 1950s. So a huge producer and consumer as well. Indian tea culture is somewhat different in that tea is usually consumed as masala chai, chai just meaning tea, masala meaning mixed, but it's heavily spiced and sweetened and has milk in it traditionally. So you can see here a Indian masala chai recipe with ginger, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, cardamom, a lot of Indian black tea, milk, and sugar. This is actually common for several other psychoactive substances. We'll talk later about pan or betel nut, which is a chewed stimulant. India is by far the largest consumer, but where pan or betel nut originated in Southeast Asia, it was just a bit of a nut from the areca palm tree wrapped in a leaf from a plant called piper beetle with a little bit of alkali like lime added to it. But in India now, pan has, well, ginger and cinnamon and cloves and many other things. Wow, guess what? We'll talk about that in a later lecture. To conclude this lecture, though, I just want to mention these intriguing parallels between tea and coffee. Well, first of all, they're the same drug, caffeine. Of course, there are other caffeine plants, yerba mate, cola, yaupon, but these are the big two. They both initially spread through religious institutions, Sufi Islam in the case of coffee, Mahayana Buddhism in the case of tea. Both then subsequently secularize and move into elite culture, and then begin moving out of elite culture into popular culture. Both first entered the European market as medicine sold by apothecaries. Both were later sold in specialized shops, coffee houses, tea houses, and both then move into primarily home consumption. Both globalize at roughly the same time. In the Americas, well, in Europe in particular, coffee a little sooner, tea a little later, but roughly the same time. And they both played very important cultural, political, and world historical roles, which I hope to have covered adequately in these lectures. And they even have somewhat similar geographies of production. Tea can be grown outside of the tropics where coffee can't. But if you watch the coffee lecture, you may have remembered that a number of countries are major exporters of both. Rwanda and Burundi in Africa in particular. Coffee and tea are crucial to their export economies. And places like Java, Sri Lanka, or Ceylon have historically produced both high-quality coffee and high-quality tea. So there are these really interesting parallels. And my last slide is just a question. Is there a real connection between early modernity and the globalization of stimulants? So caffeine is definitely a stimulant, and we have seen how these two stimulants just spread explosively around much of the world in the early modern period after 1500. The next lecture will look at tobacco, and tobacco is usually classified as a stimulant, and we get the same pattern here. So this has led a number of scholars to speculate, was there something about the changes inherent in the world beginning to globalize and modernize, as implied by the term early modern, that's connected to stimulating psychoactive substances. I'm not going to give a precise answer on that, but it is interesting to consider these issues, and I hope you will be able to listen to the lecture on tobacco, which will be forthcoming. Thank you.